Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my paper, and also thank you for organizing the seminar series. As you might notice, we have changed the title a little. It's now called Expressive Voting versus Self-Serving Ignorance. And I should say that this is joint work with Markus Undorf, who's also at the University of Innsbruck. Well, if you look into the election outcomes from the last 10 years, you might see that they were often not in favor of stricter climate change mitigation policies. But, you know, one might argue that climate change mitigation is actually something very ethical to do. And it seems like economists agree on the point that democratic choices often lead to more ethical choices than individual choices. Well, this notion goes back to the very low pivotality of a choice in a democratic setting, and hence the expressive motive dominates the instrumental motives, and this leads to more ethical choices. I guess it's easier to understand when we look into the formal expression for that. So the expected utility from a non-selfish vote consists of the instrumental utility part, so this is payoff related, and the expressive utility part, this is like ethically related. And when you look at the instrumental part, this is multiplied by the very low pivotality of your vote. So it's, so to say, discounted, and hence the expressive ethical part plays a larger role, and this might lead you to vote ethically, although individually you would have taken the instrumental utility more into account. Now, the aim of this paper is to contribute to explaining the discrepancy between these theoretical predictions of having pretty ethical votes and the actual election outcomes. Of course, all of this is only interesting if there is a conflict between the instrumental utility component and the expressive utility component. Because in that case, decision makers, or in our context, voters, they experience cognitive dissonance. So at the one hand, they want to think of themselves as an environmentally friendly, altruistic decision maker. And on the other hand, they also want to maximize their monetary payoff. And as I've already said, if the pivotality is low, you can solve this cognitive dissonance in favor of the expressive voting with an ethical vote. But of course, there are other strategies you may use to reduce your cognitive dissonance. For example, you might just avoid the information about the potential negative side effects of your choices. And when you're ignorant about that, you can vote something that maximizes your payoff. And this might actually have played a role in the last 10 years, because here you could just stay within your filter bubble and, so to say, ignore all the other information around. Another possibility to reduce cognitive dissonance would be diffusion of responsibility. So you tell yourself that it's not just your responsibility what is finally implemented, but also other people contribute to that, and hence you yourself could choose more selfishly. Now, in this paper, we want to investigate the interplay of these different strategies to resolve cognitive dissonance. First of all, we look into expressive voting and information avoidance, and then to a lesser extent also into the diffusion of responsibility. And we ask if we still observe expressive voting, if voters can actually avoid information on the effects of their choices. Now, normally I would explain the literature, but I guess we don't really have time for that. So I will just jump towards the experimental design. Our setup is pretty simple. So subjects have to make 24 decisions where they choose between option A or option B. These two options differ in terms of their payoffs and in terms of their externalities. These externalities are implemented as donations to carbon offsets, and this has the nice property that, like this, decisions made in the lab actually have consequences beyond the lab and contribute a little bit to climate change mitigation. We implement different payoff differences. So there will be differences of 5 and 10. This is what we consider low, and 15 and 20. This will be considered the high payoff differences. The externality of option A is always equal to 15, and the externality of option B will be 0 or 30, and both are equally likely. Now we implement situations with conflicting interests. Here, the option with the higher payoff has the lower externality, and situations with aligned interests, more for experimental reasons. Here, the option with the higher payoff also has the higher externality, and both are equally likely. When we look at our treatments, we have 8, and they are implemented in a between subjects design, and we vary the institutional setting as well as the observability of option B's externality. Under full information, it's pretty straightforward. So for both options, you immediately observe both externalities. In the hidden information setting, the externality of option B is initially hidden, but there is a button which you can click. It's optional, so you don't have to click it. And clicking is associated with a tiny cost, which will in the end be payoff irrelevant. But we just wanted to capture the idea that in the real world, so outside the lab, it takes some effort to actually gather information, although it might in the end be costless. So that's why we have these tiny payoff irrelevant costs. Yeah, so you need to click to reveal the externality. Then regarding the institutional setting, there will be the market setting, the dictator setting, and the voting setting, for which we have 2 different treatments. In the market setting, subjects just take the roles of buyers and they decide between 2 virtual products. In the dictator setting, subjects are split into groups of 3, and one of the group members is randomly determined to be the dictator, and this dictator decides which option to implement for all group members. So if the dictator decides to implement option A, for example, then everybody will contribute 15 to the carbon offset, and everybody will earn the payoff associated with option A. Now for voting, we split subjects into groups of 3, that is the small group, or in groups of 11. And the final option is determined through majority voting. So the option receiving the larger number of votes will be implemented for everybody in the group. Now the experimental procedure is pretty standard, so I guess it makes sense to just move on to our behavioral predictions. These are based on a cognitive dissonance model, which is based on Kono and Rabin's models, but we extend their theoretical framework in order to incorporate information avoidance. And throughout our behavioral predictions, we'll be looking into conflict situations, and we'll go through the different institutional settings, starting off with the market setting, and always first look into full information and then go to the hidden information treatment. Now, when you choose the selfish option in the market, your utility consists of your endowment minus the price minus this term, the experienced cognitive dissonance, because, well, you know that you could have chosen the other option and then you would have contributed more to the carbon offset. When you choose the ethical option, of course, this term of cognitive dissonance disappears. So your utility is just endowment minus price. And you will choose the ethical option if the cognitive dissonance exceeds the price difference. So really straightforward. For lower price differences, you will choose the ethical option. Now, when we look into hidden information, we'll again compare 2 utilities. The first one is the utility when you stay uninformed, when you do not click and then choose the selfish option. And what you see here is that this component comes in. It's the self-deception. So you know that you could have clicked and informed yourself about the externality of the option and then chosen according to the situation you gathered. But you didn't do that, so you experienced this utility component. Then there is the expected payoff you have when you are still planning to reveal the information, but you haven't done so yet. And you know that when you reveal and discover a conflict of interests, you would choose the option that has the higher contribution to the carbon offset. So this is your expected utility in that case. When we take the two conditions together, we can derive a price range in which subjects, decision makers, will exploit moral wiggle room. So under full information, they would choose the ethical option, but if they can stay ignorant about the consequences of their choices, they will do so and choose selfishly, which is the definition of moral wiggle room exploitation. Now, okay, I just said this, and we expect more exploitation of moral wiggle room for lower price differences in our parameterization. Okay, then we move on to the group settings. Now, when we want to compare individual decision-making to democratic choices, the problem is that there are two things happening at the same time. First of all, the decision not only affects my own payoff and the contribution to the carbon offset, but also the payoff of all group members. So other regarding preferences now also play a role. And the second factor that comes into play is the lower probability of being decisive, because now it would be a democratic decision and also the other votes matter. So we include our dictator treatment because we try to isolate the first effect and then later also look at the second effect. To do so, we introduce two additional variables into our theoretical framework. There is this zeta, it captures the other regarding preferences. That means when you as the dictator choose in favor of the green option and a conflict of interests, then you experience some disutility because your choice reduces your group members' monetary payoffs. And there is the utility component nu. It's the utility from the larger green impact now, because now it's not just your contribution, but the contribution of the entire group that you influence. And this condition for choosing ethically, compared to the one we had before, is slightly extended by these two elements. And ex ante, we can't say which of the two has the stronger effect, if it's the green impact or the altruism factor. But ex post, when looking into the data, we will know which of the two would drives the behavior of our subjects. Under hidden information, it's the same procedure as before, and we'll derive a condition price range where more wiggle room is exploited. Now, when we move on to our voting settings, so these two equations are basically voting models brought into our context. And what you just should focus on is here the probability of being pivotal. And taking these two utilities from selfish and from voting for the ethical option together, we have a condition under which you would vote for the ethical option. Now look here, we have the probability of being pivotal in the denominator. That means if the probability of being pivotal shrinks, the left-hand side gets larger. So we would expect to observe more ethical choices in the larger groups compared to the smaller groups. So in voting 11 compared to voting 3. Now, when we compare this condition to the one before in the dictator treatment, first of all, assuming that the experienced cognitive dissonance in the two treatments is identical, we would again expect to observe more ethical behavior in voting 3 than in the dictator treatment, but only under the assumption that the cognitive dissonance would be identical. And when we look into our data, we'll see if this is a realistic assumption or not. Now we move on to hidden information. The procedure is as before. And here again is the condition for moral wiggle room exploitation. And when we look into it, we see that under full information, people would have voted for the ethical choice, so there would have been expressive voting, but when information can be avoided, they prefer to remain ignorant and choose selfishly. Now, if we focus on the right-hand side here, I know it's not straightforward to see, but just believe me. So if this mu is sufficiently large, then for a decrease in the pivotality, the right-hand side shrinks faster than the left-hand side. And this would mean that there is a larger price range where we would see more wiggle room exploitation. So more wiggle room exploitation in the voting 11 treatment compared to the voting 3 treatment. Okay, and this is what I just said. Now let's take a look into our results. First, we'll look into full information. We always focus on selfish choices in conflict situations. Here we have all data, then the situations with high payoff differences, and here the situations with low payoff differences. And we see immediately that with high payoff differences, the institutional setting doesn't really play a role. But there are differences when we focus on situations with low payoff differences. In fact, the share of selfish choices is lowest in the market treatment and in voting 11. So when we compare market and dictator, it must be that these other regarding preferences now play a role, because the selfish option is associated with an altruistic component, and hence people vote for the selfish and also altruistic option. Comparing dictator and voting 3, assuming that the cognitive dissonance would be identical in both treatments, we would expect more selfish choices in the dictator treatment than in the voting 3 treatment. However, what we observe is the opposite. So what must be happening here between these 2 treatments is some diffusion of responsibility that drives selfish choices up in the voting 3 treatment. And then finally, and probably most interestingly, when we compare voting 3 to voting 11, all what changes is the change in the pivotality. And you see that the share of selfish choices decreases a lot. So this must be due to expressive voting under full information. Okay, here are some regression results that just—
You have like 2 or 3 more minutes, Katharina, okay?
Okay, that confirm what I've just said. And so we look into hidden information, and what we see here is that no matter if looking into the lower payoff differences or the higher payoff differences, the institutional setting doesn't play a role anymore. So when information can be avoided, the effects of the institutional settings have disappeared on the share of selfish choices, of course. And when we take these 2 observations together and investigate if more wiggle room is exploited, so if the share of selfish choices under hidden information is significantly larger than under full information, here are the regressions for that. We see that the hidden information dummy is highly significant for the market treatment and also for the large voting treatment. So there is more wiggle room exploitation in these 2 settings, and to a lesser extent when the differences in payoffs is larger. So we can say that expressive voting no longer plays a role to resolve cognitive dissonance when information avoidance is possible. So let me conclude. What we do with this paper is we find some robust evidence of expressive voting under full information. Under hidden information, there are no differences between the institutional settings, and overall choices are more selfish. And when we take this together, there is more wiggle room exploitation in markets and in large groups. So we find that expressive voting is substituted by information avoidance. And in fact, information avoidance has the same effect as a preference reversal for those voters with intermediate preference intensities. And this will lead to a polarization of voter preferences. Now, this was the paper, but if we actually go beyond the paper, one can show that information avoidance can result in convexities in the voters' preferences, which have before been concave. And then in a Hotelling-Downs model of election, this would lead to a polarization of policies. And this would then be what we started off with, the policies, the implemented policies that we have observed in the recent years. Okay, so I hope I managed to finish roughly on time. Thank you for your attention. And I'm looking forward to my discussant. I stop